Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you're well, and also welcome to this lunchtime webinar. My name is Katie Go. I'm the project manager at the Equal Media and Culture Centre, or EMCC. EMCC is an intersectional feminist hub for research and advocacy for women's equality in Scotland's media and culture sectors. EMCC is a project housed within the Feminist Policy and Advocacy Organisation in Gender. We're delighted to welcome you to this session, which is on our latest piece of research, From Token to Transformation, the impact of Creative Scotland's EDI Action Plan requirements. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the session will run, and then we'll kick off. But first, just to say that if you're requiring captions, we do have a live captioner here, so hopefully you're able to see the captions, or if you click on Zoom to the CC button. If you're having any issues and want to see the captions, just put it in the chat box, the Q&A box, and my colleague Sharon will be able to help you out with that. All right, so in the first half of the session, I'm going to take us through our new research paper and discuss some of our key findings and recommendations. We'll then have a short break of about 5 minutes, and afterwards we'll broaden the discussion with 2 guest panelists. So really pleased that we're joined by 2 experts, Veronique AA Lapeyre, Director of Scottish Contemporary Art Network, and Halina Rifai, who is a project lead at We're Here Scotland and Creative Balance and an audio industry professional. So I'm going to ask Veronique and Halina some questions, and then we'll also open up to questions from our audience at the end. We'll try to keep about 15 minutes for that. And just so everyone is aware, we are recording today's webinar. You're not obviously on camera, but if you have any questions that you're putting into the chat box, they'll be read aloud just so that you're aware of that. All right, so I'm going to begin with talking a little bit about the background to this research. So our new piece of research explores the impact of Creative Scotland's requirement for an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, or EDI Action Plan, by recipients of their National Lottery Open Fund for organisations. So we decided to do this research partially because at the end of 2024, the Scottish Government announced a review of Creative Scotland as part of the programme for government. As part of its remit, the review was to look at whether Creative Scotland's remit is fit for the diversity of a dynamic sector and resilient in the face of change, and also whether Creative Scotland's remit causes unintended barriers to delivery, and whether there are emerging areas that require specific support, as well as many other different parts of the remit too. And as well as the independent review, we also knew that the Independent Culture Fair Work Task Force was set to release its recommendations. So we knew we would have 2 significant sets of recommendations coming to the Scottish Government and also to Creative Scotland at the end of 2025, or also the beginning of 2026. So this research was commissioned by the Equal Media and Culture Centre to run independently alongside the review to ensure specific EDI insights on Creative Scotland's processes were made publicly available, and to, I guess, keep EDI within focus for all these conversations going on. So this research offers, we hope, actionable recommendations to enhance Creative Scotland's EDI requirements and help to move beyond tokenistic tick boxes. We were also curious about what impact EDI requirements would have on women in the sector as well. So we asked independent consultant Ellie Hutchinson to be the researcher for this piece of work, and Ellie conducted the research between May and November of 2025, and we just published it in January this month. So unfortunately, Ellie wasn't able to make it today to present these findings. So this means that if you have very specific or somewhat niche questions on research methodology that we use, I might not be able to answer your question at this session. However, we do have a methodology included in the paper, which is online, that you can have a look at. And if you have any questions beyond that, you can get in touch with myself or Sharon, my colleague at EMCC, and we'll try to put the question to Ellie or put you in touch with Ellie. All right, so I'm going to begin just with some background, kind of talking about what we did for the research. So we decided to focus on the recipients of Creative Scotland's Open Fund for organisations. We decided to focus on this funding stream because there were several years of publicly available data sets for us to look at, and also because organisations are more likely than individual artists to ask for more funding for longer periods of time, and therefore would be more likely to have to write an EDI action plan as part of their requirement for funding. So what Ellie did was she looked at survey responses from 43 recipients of the Open Fund for Organisations across 5 years and conducted 9 in-depth interviews with recipients of the Open Fund for Organisations. We also asked Creative Scotland to share their insights on the EDI Action Plan requirement, and their responses have been included throughout the research paper as well. I have leapt way too far ahead there. Let me move over here. There we go. So I thought we would start maybe with some context around EDI, just so that we're all beginning sort of from the same foundation. So we know that at a national, local, and individual level across Scotland, culture and media help shape societal attitudes and have the power to transform our communities for the better. There is an economic argument to be made for ensuring EDI is implemented in culture workforces. We have lots of research out there shows that diverse teams drive innovation and outperform their peers on profitability and value creation. There is also, of course, ethical human rights considerations for achieving equality within the culture sector. Scotland's culture sectors have a responsibility to ensure that all individuals have equal opportunity to participate and lead activity. But yet we know from research that we have done, other organisations have done, that women, people of colour, disabled people, and lots of other different protected characteristics as well remain underrepresented in leadership positions and on boards across the culture sectors. The continual underrepresentation of women, people of colour, disabled people in leadership positions has significant consequences, making it harder for organisations to embrace diversity of thought, assert more inclusive values, or combat stereotypes. And having more women and diverse voices in leadership is not just a matter of representation. The arts and culture play a vital role in shaping Scotland's attitudes and behaviours, and securing a more equal and diverse culture sector is therefore a critical component in the building of a dynamic, globally relevant and successful Scotland. And additionally, ensuring women's participation and leadership in these spaces also serves as a cornerstone of primary prevention of violence against women and girls, which is something that we are concerned about at Engender. All right, so EDI remains quite a broad and often contested term in the culture sector, and there's a variety of meanings and applications depending on context. So our definition of EDI might be different from your definition of EDI at your workplace. At EMCC, we understand EDI to encompass a broad set of strategies aimed at transforming workforces, leadership, and outputs to be more inclusive for women, Black, and minoritized people. Scotland's culture sector is currently built on funding models which necessitate time-sensitive, intense periods of work followed by stretches of unemployment. This is a model of funding which is exclusionary of women, particularly women experiencing intersectional marginalisation and discrimination, who are less likely to benefit from traditional one-size-fits-all EDI measures. And the Creative Scotland Open Fund for Organisations EDI Action Plan requirement is an example of a one-size-fits-all EDI measure. So I think I'll speak a little bit about Creative Scotland's EDI Action Plan requirement to give a bit of that context before we move into the findings and our recommendations as well. So as I'm sure a lot of people at this webinar know, Creative Scotland is Scotland's largest funder for creative practice. It distributes funding on behalf of the Scottish Government and the National Lottery as well. As a public body, it has legal responsibilities around equality and diversity, including those outlined in the Public Sector Equality Duty. Within its strategic framework, EDI is one of Creative Scotland's core priorities, and EDI is also one of 6 key criteria that applications for funding are assessed against. All applicants must answer questions on their approaches to EDI in their activity, working with EDI and understanding barriers whenever they're applying for the Open Fund for organisations. Funding applications, including the section on the organisation's approach to EDI, are assessed by a specialist officer before then going to a panel of officers to be assessed further. And for activities over 12 months, successful applicants must then develop an EDI action plan as a condition of funding. So Creative Scotland provides an EDI action plan toolkit to help organisations develop or shape their plan. However, we found that beyond the toolkit, support offered from Creative Scotland to assist the development of these EDI plans remains quite limited. While successful applicants to the Open Fund will be put in touch with Creative Scotland's team of funding officers, they do not receive any direct advice or support from Creative Scotland's EDI team on the EDI action plan requirement. I thought it'd be helpful just to include what Creative Scotland's definition of the EDI action plan is. So It's on screen there. It is a living document which details a set of objectives for how your organization plans to address issues of inequality, disengagement, and cultural exclusion. It should focus on real change over time through specific actions and targets and clear measures of success. So I thought it'd be helpful just to understand Creative Scotland's duties before we then keep going into the findings. Um, so Creative Scotland, like other public bodies, is subject to the Public Sector Equality Duty under the Equality Act 2010. So this duty requires Creative Scotland to have due regard to the need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment, and victimisation, advance equality of opportunity, and foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who do not. So while Creative Scotland have a positive duty to promote equality, they are not a regulatory body and they do not have the authority to enforce equalities legislation. Creative Scotland's EDI team do not directly intervene where individuals feel their rights have not been upheld by an organisation or project that receives funding from Creative Scotland. These regulatory functions are generally managed by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Scotland. So that sort of leaves us with these sort of two questions or issues. As Creative Scotland does not have the authority to directly enforce EDI legislation and does not enforce organisations' EDI Action Plan, there is the potential then for gaps to exist between what funded organisations say they are doing regarding EDI in their applications and what they're doing in practice regarding EDI. And the second point is measuring the real impact of Creative Scotland's EDI Action Plan requirement, therefore presents a bit of a challenge. So we were curious about exploring these two sort of issues, if you like, in our research. So now I'm going to bring us to our findings. So our first finding from this research was that there is a wealth of informal support and networking within the sector, but a lack of formal support from Creative Scotland. So aside from the EDI Action Plan Toolkit guidance, there is currently no formal one-to-one support provided by Creative Scotland to organisations in the development of their EDI action plans. However, survey respondents and interviewees did tell us that they needed and accessed external support to complete the EDI Action Plan requirement, either from fellow organisations in the sector or board members as well. And particularly small micro-organisations drew on support from boards significantly for the EDI Action Plan requirement, and they also said that they relied on informal networks of support from partner organisations in the sector as well. Most respondents said they received no formal support from Creative Scotland. However, some did share that they had received some level of advice from Creative Scotland, and this tended to be either sort of informal conversations with staff or using the EDI Action Plan Toolkit that I talked about earlier. So as part of this research, we looked at the EDI Mainstreaming Report 2022 to 2024 that Creative Scotland published. In that, they commit to a number of equality outcomes. These outcomes commit Creative Scotland to offering accessible and inclusive services, which are clearly communicated and signposted at pre-application and post-application phases of the funding process. And they also committed to demonstrating how feedback received on these processes and practices helps inform future approaches and care and attention to the needs of applicants of their funding. So this level of formal support from Creative Scotland, we didn't find that reflected in our respondents' experiences. While the majority of respondents reported good relationships with Creative Scotland and especially with its staff, this was perceived to be dependent on the commitment of individual members of staff, especially funding officers, rather than due to processes that were built in structurally to the organisation at sort of an institutional level. So why EDI support is not formalised at Creative Scotland is most likely due to challenges of staff capacity and lack of resourcing. However, we're concerned that if applicants are receiving individual, informal advice on EDI requirements, there's therefore a question regarding the consistency and accessibility of this support. So we asked Creative Scotland about their training around EDI for their staff, and they told us that their staff receive mandatory EDI e-training, which is updated on a regular basis. And when asked about staff training opportunities in 2025, Creative Scotland told us that there is an additional programme of EDI training offered to staff, which includes bespoke training on areas including equality impact assessments, preventing harassment and anti-racism. However, this is not currently mandatory for their staff. So our second finding was that the EDI Action Plan requirement helped to formalise what many organisations were doing informally. So most respondents shared that the EDI Action Plan requirement helped to consolidate what they were already doing as an organization, and the requirement led to the creation of a living document that they would actively review and monitor. One organization shared with us that they would not have done this if it had not been a requirement for funding, but instead that their EDI work would have just stayed in people's heads. And our third finding was that funding requirements feel disproportional for small and micro organizations, and that these organizations are often led by women experiencing intersecting marginalization as well. So this was a recurring theme throughout our interviews and survey responses. Most organizations shared that Creative Scotland's EDI requirements were not proportional to the size of their organizations, and that rather the open fund for organizations application process was weighed towards larger organizations. And some respondents shared that this, because of the lack of capacity that they had to complete the applications, they regularly used AI such as ChatGPT in funding applications. Um, Another thing that we found was that all of our interviewees were women, which we weren't intending or set out to do. They just sort of happened, and reflects sort of that women are more likely to be doing funding applications than men in the sector. And most interviewees also worked at small micro organizations, typically run by one or two people. The interviewees frequently spoke about trying to complete applications while working voluntarily for their organization or working part-time or also having other responsibilities like caring duties. So this finding highlights an existing gender dimension to the often unpaid and invisible labour women are providing within the creative sector in Scotland. And respondents frequently express frustrations that the Creative Scotland Open Fund for Organisations application process is not inclusive in itself or accessible for smaller or micro organisations as well. And for women working part-time and or who are carers and or facing additional barriers due to intersecting marginalizations, the application process itself prevented them from accessing funding. This was also reported as a problem for applications and events during school holidays and like in the summertime as well. So our fourth finding is that EDI was often viewed in terms of achieving quantitative outcomes, leading to concerns about what type of information to collect and how to do so ethically. Almost all the organizations we spoke to reported struggling with gathering data on the impact of their EDI action plans. They reported finding it particularly challenging to capture data and learning that extended beyond visible headcounts on who was performing or who was curating or who was attending work as an audience member. They found it even more challenging to capture whether EDI policies and approaches outlined in their action plans for Creative Scotland were having a positive impact on their audiences, participants, and staff. And organisations we spoke to expressed a lot of uncertainty around data collection. They were worried about asking too much of their audiences or performers, and they also were curious about how to capture data and store it ethically. And they had queries around even why they were collecting data and whether this data was for their purposes or for Creative Scotland's purposes. Our fifth finding was that intersectionality was high on organisations' priorities, but there was an apparent lack of intersectional data analysis done at Creative Scotland. So many of our survey respondents did not see gender equality as a single axis issue. Rather, they reflected more on intersectional barriers to engaging in creative practice. Whereas Creative Scotland's EDI Action Plan Toolkit does not specifically speak to intersectionality beyond having a glossary definition. There's no detailed information about people who face multiple and intersecting discrimination and inequality in the culture sector. So our findings suggest, therefore, that the sector's understanding of EDI may be evolving faster than the resources and support provided by Creative Scotland. We also found that Creative Scotland had its own limitations on what intersectional analysis they can do around who's accessing their funds and who's being impacted by funded organisations' EDI requirements. When we asked Creative Scotland for an update around this area of work, they told us that historically they had no function to compare award recipients against applicant EDI data. And as of 2024, they have a better understanding of their funding base in terms of demographics and equalities characteristics, though they had yet to receive a full year of this data for full analysis when we spoke to them in 2025. They also noted that with some recent improvements, the EDI and knowledge and research teams are looking at better ways that they can analyze and disseminate the data that they have gathered, including looking at intersectionality. And our sixth and final finding was that there is a monitoring and evaluation gap on the EDI requirement. So nearly all survey respondents did not work with their funding officers on the EDI action plan after receiving funds. So whilst a lot of work might have gone into developing an EDI action plan and wider organisational EDI policies to receive funding, there was often little follow-up on what happened next and how action plans were or were not implemented beyond organisations completing project reports. There is therefore a risk that potential gaps exist between what funded organisations say they are doing regarding EDI in their applications and action plans and what they're doing in practice regarding EDI. In its EDI Mainstreaming Report 2022 to 2024, Creative Scotland note that EDI action plans are reviewed by lead officers as part of our annual reviewing and reporting cycle, end quote. Yet, Creative Scotland do not detail how the action plans are monitored, what they're evaluated against, or the level of feedback organisations receive from Creative Scotland on the impact their action plans have had during the funded activity. And Creative Scotland does not detail any monitoring and evaluation framework used for reviewing action plans as part of its annual reporting cycle either. The organisations we spoke to did not report knowledge of a formal monitoring and evaluation framework beyond the requirement to implement an EDI action plan. And generally, the organisations we spoke to, they really wanted enhanced support from Creative Scotland. They pointed to supportive and collaborative learning rather than strict accountability measures to better ensure EDI commitments were upheld by organisations, including themselves. Encouraging innovation and creative approaches and sharing learning was reviewed as potentially more impactful than report writing and data collection. Some respondents also believed that the sector should be doing more on EDI with or without Creative Scotland holding organisations accountable. They recommended that Creative Scotland explore options including peer support networks and enhanced toolkits that would enable organisations to evaluate and monitor their EDI ambitions beyond funding requirements. So we're going to come to our recommendations now. Our first recommendation to Creative Scotland is that they should develop an enhanced monitoring and evaluation framework for EDI requirements that puts support and collaborative learning at its core. So in order to see real impact from EDI requirements, we recommend that Creative Scotland develops this enhanced monitoring and evaluation framework, and this should go beyond annual reports and end of project reports, rather than the current one-way communication stream in which funded organisations report on EDI with little or no input from Creative Scotland. Support and collaborative learning should be at the core of evaluating and monitoring the effectiveness of EDI action plans and requirements. And we recommend that Creative Scotland's EDI team and funding officers are better resourced to undertake more meaningful monitoring and evaluation with funded organisations, including regular check-ins that go beyond written reports. So we recommend that a monitoring and evaluation framework could look something like this and could include these sort of points. So outlining EDI approaches, including aims, what resourcing and budgeting is going towards EDI, the impact EDI approaches and measures have had during different stages of a funded activity, the challenges an organisation is encountering when trying to achieve EDI aims, and the support an organisation needs from Creative Scotland to achieve its EDI aims as well. So a little additional recommendation that we have as part of our first recommendation is that we recommend that EDI evaluation and monitoring frameworks take into account the size of an organisation, and that Creative Scotland progresses with its commitment to make EDI requirements proportional to the size of an organisation. So our second recommendation is that Creative Scotland should prioritise funding and support for the creation of EDI peer learning and champions networks, with a special focus on those working in challenging contexts. So we found that plenty of informal sharing of EDI good practice is already happening in the sector. However, formalising networks and knowledge sharing is an invaluable opportunity to highlight good practice across the sector, enabling organisations to share EDI policies and practices and champion progress as well. So when we put this to Creative Scotland, they shared with us that they are intending to explore peer-to-peer support spaces for multi-year funded organisations, depending on the outcome of their organisational review. We recommend that this is extended to the Open Fund for organisations and other funded streams as well. We also recommend that good practice, case studies and learnings on EDI should be made available by Creative Scotland to potential applicants of its funding streams alongside the EDI Action Plan toolkit. Our third recommendation is that Creative Scotland should provide officers and application assessors with mandatory enhanced EDI training. So one of our key findings was that despite Creative Scotland stating that they do not provide formal support around EDI action plans and applications to the Open Fund for organisations, many organisations we spoke to reported having some level of EDI advice from funding officers. So to ensure that EDI support is consistent and accessible, we recommend that Creative Scotland should provide its officers and application assessors with enhanced EDI training. And additionally, we recommend that Creative Scotland ensures any externally recruited and formally contracted people who are assessing funding applications receive some level of mandatory EDI training as well. So our fourth and final recommendation is that Creative Scotland should undertake research on the capacity micro and small organisations have to adhere to Creative Scotland funding requirements, including gendered and intersectional pressures on staff. It's important to acknowledge that there was a gender dimension to our research, so only women took part in interviews, like I mentioned before. Respondents shared that it is frequently women who undertake the emotional, practical, and oftentimes unpaid labour of completing funding applications and EDI action plans in small and micro organisations and providing voluntary support to others in the sector as well. We suggest that these findings should be mapped against Creative Scotland's own EDI and Fair Work strategic priorities and future ambitions as well. So, in conclusion, a transformative approach to EDI would enable Scotland's diverse creative communities to see themselves represented across art forms, locations, and empowered to improve their own artistic practices in a rich and diverse cultural landscape. To achieve this, both organisations and Creative Scotland need to adapt. They need greater capacity, more resourcing, more formalised networks and peer spaces, and more time to do the thinking required for transformative work and more space to learn as well. We also need to acknowledge who is doing this work and the gendered and intersectional dimensions at play within the sector. The interviewees were all women, and many undertook the funding process with minimal support or even pay. The invisible unpaid labour of women in Scotland's cultural sector must be addressed to ensure that the very process of applying for funding and writing EDI action plans does not itself perpetuate women's inequality. Organisations also need to see transparent processes around the purpose and impact of this work, specifically what happens when all the information that is collected and what happens if organisations don't fulfil their EDI action plans too. Without this clarity in this sector, we think that cynicism tends to flourish and EDI just becomes seen as another box to tick without wider value, which is not the true purpose of EDI. So that is our presentation on our research. I'm aware that I've spoken quite quickly on many, many different things. There's a lot of information to digest. We're going to have a 5-minute break now, and then we're going to go to our panelists to have a bit of a broader discussion around EDI in the culture sector. And also just to note that our research paper is available on our website and there's like so much more information that you can find through that as well. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to keep going with our session and begin our panel conversation now too. I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists for today. So first of all, Veronique Lapeyre is Director of Scottish Contemporary Art Network, and Veronique has over 16 years of experience working within Scottish organisations with a global reach. Her work spans across programming, organisational development, and strategic advocacy and storytelling campaigns. Veronique is also the founder of Pero and Project Zenana, supporting Black, Asian, mixed heritage, and people of colour working in creative industries. Veronique currently sits on committees including Culture Counts and the Fife African Caribbean Network and was chair of SCAN's board from 2020 to 2022. We are also joined by Halina. Halina Rifai is Communications Manager and Projects Lead at We Are Here Scotland, which creates spaces and opportunities with Black and global majority people in Scotland's creative industries. And she's also co-lead of Creative Balance, a research initiative exploring well-being for racialized communities in the sector. She is also an award-winning podcast and audio producer, specializing in socio-political, mental health, and cultural content with work for outlets including BBC Radio 4, the Ferret, and Mental Health Foundation. Welcome, Veronique and Halina. I'm going to stop sharing so that I'm hoping the three of us will be on screen for everyone to see at once. So let me do that. And hopefully just makes it a bit, nicer to see us all together. Just to say also to the audience, if you have any questions about the first part of our session on the presentation and the research, or if you have any questions for our panelists, if you put them in the sort of Q&A function, we'll come to those sort of in the last 10, 15 minutes. So I thought I just like to begin with kind of like a reflection from the both of you, if that's all right, on the research. I know that you have listened to me going on about it a lot now, and also had a chance to look at the paper beforehand. So I'm just curious if you had any like initial feelings around it, thoughts on it, anything missing from it as well, or anything that was challenging around it. Veronique, can we come to you first? Is that all right?
Sure, yeah. I think firstly, I think it's really great to have this report. I think it's a lot of things we maybe knew anecdotally, but I think it's always great to have it there in writing in black and white, and also it supports people to use this report to create change and speak to change makers. So that's really useful. I think my big reflection, I was scribbling on post-it notes, I had notes from yesterday, but I think my big reflection is firstly, how much best practice is happening in Scotland. I'm always reminded of that when I speak to people outside of Scotland about equalities, diversity, inclusion, and access. And I think that's really something we shouldn't lose sight of. There's so much good work happening on all different fronts. I think also I was struck by how important EDIA is. We have to remind ourselves all the time. We know it's important, but I think it's really great that you've articulated why it's important. And particularly kind of that part of allowing people to access creative practice, so self and community actualization. I think it's really, really strong. I suppose challenging. There's lots of great things to unpick within the report, but I suppose what I was conscious of as well is as you mentioned, how much unpaid labour goes into equalities, diversity, and inclusion in Scotland. Particularly, I was thinking around it's often people with their own lived experience who feel driven to create change within their organisations or really embed it within their programmes, and how a lot of that is unrecognised. And often individuals in small organisations and grassroots organisations are really pushing things forward, and that is being picked up by other organisations, but perhaps not credited as well. So I think that's my challenge, and maybe a thing that wasn't fully captured. But there's lots more I could say. I'll pass over to Halina.
Yeah, I would echo Veronique. I think just for purposes of time and so on, I wanted to focus on two things that stood out in terms of the key findings, and that was the sector's understanding of EDI maybe evolving faster than the support created as provided by Creative Scotland. And within many of the organisations that we are here, Scotland and Creative Balance, including working with both of you, and I can see names in the attendees as well who we've worked with as well, and the amount of work that has been done that is far more progressive than what is happening within Creative Scotland internally, and what they're projecting is something that I was really pleased to see that noted. And I think the other thing was that there's potential gaps between the EDI work organisations say that they're doing in application forms and what they're actually doing. And obviously the cliched tick box exercise that we often talk about. I think a lot of the elements weren't surprising to me, and I think that there's often a lot of enthusiasm within this, but not always the competence. And people want to do EDI well generally, but they don't know how to sometimes or often. And there's a limit to I guess how much you can understand barriers that you've never experienced, which is why lack of leadership, the diverse leadership matters so much. You can train individuals, but if the same people are always making the same decisions in the same way, then outcomes don't change. And I think that really does come back to how important and pivotal lived experience is as well.
Thanks so much for that, both of you. Yeah, really interesting hearing your reflections on it. Um, I wanted to ask you both a question regarding sort of the EDI as a requirement, I suppose, in funding applications. So in our paper, we heard from organisations that they don't believe that Creative Scotland is handling EDI requirements as well as they could or should be. I was wondering, how useful do you think EDI requirements are in funding applications to make sure that they're done? We heard a bit from people we spoke to that they wouldn't have, they find it really valuable to put it sort of down on paper. I'm wondering, how useful it is to have EDI as a requirement to funding, and where do you think improvements could be made to EDI requirements on funding applications as well? So it's a bit of a two-pronged question. Veronique, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I've got lots of opinions on this, but I think it's generally a good thing. There are people, I hate to use the word journey, but there are organizations are on a journey with EDI. Some, as you said, are really progressive. Lots are doing really great best practice. Lots of people are maybe starting on it, and they wouldn't be doing it they wouldn't be focusing their mind to it so much if it wasn't a funding requirement. I think it's really important. Perhaps the way it's being asked of them, perhaps the way it's being measured, evaluated, supported is all up for being refreshed. But I do think it's important. And I've forgotten the second part of the question.
I was also wondering what improvements you think could be made to EDI as a requirement on funding applications. Like, is it working as it is now, or what improvements could
Yeah.
be made?
I mean, I think that goes back to Helena's point. I think it's about education or providing opportunities for education and support. And I was also thinking about how every organization has a very particular context that they're working in and with very different groups of people and multiple groups of people. So I think to develop a plan, to have it as part of your funding application, I do think that organizations need better support. And I think also there needs to be, also as Lena mentioned, bringing people with lived experience into the conversation and paying them properly to help others. So yeah, I think that needs a bit of consideration and resource put to it.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Halina, I was wondering if you have other things to add to that.
Yes, the requirements can be very, very useful and formalise good intention, but I think without the follow up, it's all a bit performative, and then you're leading to no accountability as well. So I think we need to talk about why diverse talent isn't progressing, and people generally, if we talk about unconscious bias as well, people tend to hire people who maybe look like them, and after a certain point choosing not to examine that it isn't unconscious anymore. It's a choice, and effectively it's, again, I hate to use cliches, but it's the diversity obviously enriches what it is, the actual artistic output within what is put out there. I think that but coming back to intersectionality is a key point on all of this, and it's it's a framework, I think, is something that we've become really used to talking about within the organisations that I'm in, and there's not enough intersectional thinking when it comes to these things. So it's more like additive thinking. So, for example, if you had a black disabled woman, it would be race plus disability plus sex, rather than understanding that her experience is it's as distinct and compounded. So it's really about looking through those various layers. And if we all look at ourselves and the various, barriers that we've had to kind of work through and how we're built as individuals and characters, then I think that that's something that we really have to always go back to. I think a lot of the time as well, I think these things they become so complex. And if we kind of just simplify things and go back to the individual and try to look at that in a way. So, I mean, effectively at the moment, it feels like it's designed for compliance, not transformation. And that's something that I think really needs to change.
Yeah, I think that's really what we find with this research. And it's a bit like, you sort of are almost like you can see the sort of transformative qualities that EDI can bring, but it's like we need to like keep pushing to get there. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit or bring in the independent review of Creative Scotland that was published at the end of last year. So the review found that, and I'm quoting, there was some concern that the focus on Creative Scotland's priorities, which includes EDI alongside Fair Work, environmental sustainability, and international, detracts from the quality of art, culture, and creativity, end quote. Which I thought was quite an interesting reflection that was in the review. I was wondering what your thoughts are on this finding from the review and whether by having an EDI requirement, there's a risk that EDI is seen as separate from artistic practice when organisations are applying for funding from places like Creative Scotland. Halina, I was wondering if I could come to you first.
So I will push back on that framing. EDI isn't separate from artistic quality; it enables it, and I think that question, it protects the status quo. It assumes that the current system is producing the best art, but it's actually filtering out talent, not finding it. And the as I've said previously, the diverse perspectives, they make richer work, and that's not controversial. It's the real drain on artistic quality is when talented people, they spend all their energy fighting for access instead of making their art. And then I guess Scottish culture is the one that it's what loses, because it becomes poorer when it's only reflecting a narrow slice of who actually lives here. When we effectively look round, especially within the organisations that we work within as well, and the representation that's there. So I think that framing is wrong, and it's, yeah, I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much, Halina. Veronique, I was wondering what you think of that framing of artistic versus EDI, that's kind of in that review.
Yeah, totally agree with everything Helena said, basically. I think that kind of way of thinking should be challenged when it's whenever and wherever it pops up, and it does crop up. I think also often the language around EDI and talking about EDI policies or action plans, or how to embed it within an organization, when you're talking to someone about it, you can hear all of these what's the word? Incorrect perspectives and views, and I think they should always be challenged. You should always call them out, and especially the phrase tick box exercise. I also hate that phrase too. And I think whenever you hear it, please say stop. Let's think about that. Do we really mean that? Yeah, that's all I have to add. But yeah, Liam is totally right.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So I'm aware that we have some questions coming in. I still have lots of questions to ask you both, but actually there's a bit of an overlap with someone else's question too, so maybe we'll jump to that now. Um, Ruth was wondering about hearing specific examples of good practice in EDI in the culture sector, which is one of my questions as well. I was wondering if you just have maybe one example of some good practice or a case that comes to mind when it comes to like embedding, I guess, EDI into artistic practice and breaking apart that framework that we just spoke about. Veronique, I was wondering if you've got an example.
Yeah, I suppose I've got a few, but I won't name the organizations just in case I've got the details wrong. But I suppose, there are things such as building in what I would consider the basics. You know, as Elena mentioned, it's thinking about a person's experience in the round and what they need. And I think building in time, if you're working with participants or artists, building in time to really understand how they work, what their circumstances are, what their situations are, um, what access support they might need. Sometimes people don't have the language to articulate that up front. Some people do. They're really great and they've got support access workers with working with them, and they've got they're very on it with their needs. But just building that time into projects, I think building in a bit of flex time as well in case things do come up. I think we should be, one of the things that struck me about the report was we do work in a very intensive, time sensitive, precarious system, and that can have knock-on effects for people's projects. So I think things like access riders, I think building in access budgets, I think the money has to be there. You have to build it in at the start of your projects and your organizational core budget. I think every time you have an event, you should have a little checklist and go through it and think through all the different ways that you can broaden the audience, invite people, support them to travel, support them with accommodation if they might need. And I think also, yeah, tapping into your peer networks and peer learning is really important as well in terms of best practice. But there's lots more examples we could probably talk
Yeah, thanks, Veronique. Halina, anything about that for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Veronique just said, the access element is just so important. I think also I'm just going to name a couple of things as opposed to organisations. I think that things like, let's go back to the Creative Scotland element, application process, language, applying in writing, having access to apply in audio and video, becoming just standard, building therapeutic support into programs, into for workforce and so on, because the navigating this sector, the impact it takes on your well-being is sometimes utterly wild. And I think that also what we did with Creative Balance is that we have started to build consultants. So consultants with lived experience who don't cover the intersections that we do. And I think that is something that really is transformative. And we've learned, I cannot begin to tell you how much we have learned already by doing that as well. And paying, like Veronique says as well, by paying them fairly and properly.
Yeah, thanks so much. I also feel like with EDI, there's no like you get to a point where you've like completed it and you are like the best practice as well. It's always such a learning curve and you're always like, yeah, on the journey, which is such a cliche way of putting it. But I think if you become quite rigid around it or decide that what you're doing is the right way of doing it, I feel like you can kind of also that can lead to just you're not willing to grow and learn. I think what really came across in our research is like this need for like openness and like learning and collaboration when it comes to that accountability thing, to make sure people are actually fulfilling what they're saying they're doing around EDI. Because I think if we police it and punish people for not doing certain things, that just seems I feel like that will just shut the conversation down completely. If there's another question that we have, do the panelists or Katie have any thoughts on how Creative Scotland or culture organizations could move towards valuing EDI in practice and recognizing tangible EDI efforts rather than written down in action plans, etc. So how Creative Scotland or culture organizations can move towards valuing EDI in practice and recognizing tangible EDI efforts rather than written down action plans, etc. I don't know if Halina or Veronique, you've got any immediate thoughts on that.
Do you want to go, Veronique?
You go. I'll go after. Sorry.
Okay. So I think shifting the documentation to demonstration. It's going from that, it's all about paperwork all the time. And so maybe instead of asking organisations to write action plans, ask them to show what's actually changed within their organisation, who's being paid, who's in leadership, who's making decisions, who's benefiting from the work. And I think it's, recognising good EDI often looks like removing barriers rather than adding processes. So, yeah, I think that's maybe one of the things, but I'll let Veronique.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think the key word there was recognizing. And I think that also is about perspective, about it being EDI is external to you, your work or your program, and it's not, it should be part of what you're doing. So I suppose if it's about recognition, then it's about spending more time with people who have intersecting lived experience, really understanding what impacts of the project, the program has had on them, checking back in with your communities and seeing how things have accumulated over time. It's about qualitative data if you really like data. And but doing that in a way that's not extractive or demanding, or asking people to provide a case study or whatever it may be in a way that suits you and your language or the way you want to see it. So I think often that can just be spending more time in communities or empowering that community to get on and do the thing they want to do without too much interference from your organization. But yeah, I think there's something there about recognize and looking. I'm not sure.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think we might only have time for one more question just because of timing and making sure everyone gets a chance to speak. I mean, someone asked a question around, are there any other countries where EDI is strongly embedded in arts funding that you would encourage them to look at? I don't know if either of you have something that comes to mind. I don't. I don't think I can think of a country that has nailed EDI, unfortunately. If anyone has a country in mind or an organization, please do share. It would be wonderful to hear about them. Another question, which I think will be our last one, is that in the music industry in Scotland, we have a good evidence base for gender inequality in pay, safety, opportunity, etc. How can the grassroots organisers who are doing the work influence the rest of the industry to take action? It's really infuriating to see new research coming out and seeing the situation is not improving despite all the talk of EDI from bigger organisations. And we share definitely that frustration. So I was wondering if you would like to answer Lou's question on, yeah, how can grassroots organizers who are doing the work influence the rest of the industry to take action around inequality?
Yeah, so this is frustration that I, like you, I feel deeply. And we keep producing evidence, but it feels sometimes that nothing changes. I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts about the music industry, particularly in Glasgow. I think most of the venues are owned by men anyway. But I guess the we grassroots are organisations are doing the work. But we don't control the venues, the budgets, the festivals, broadcast slots when it comes to the music elements. And I think we need to stop giving labour and expertise away for free. I think if bigger organisations want to look like they're doing EDI, then they should be paying people who actually know how to do it. And I think there's a lot around collective power, not just networks, but actual coalitions that say, you know, we won't work with organisations that don't actually meet these standards. I think there needs to be, I think it needs to rely a lot on reputation and public accountability. And there's been a lot of conversation in the circles that we're in as well about task forces and moving forward potentially with something that that demonstrates that there's people there to show a different route for people.
Yeah, I think that's all super relevant, but also equally sharing all the frustrations about how things aren't system changes isn't happening fast enough in all sectors in the collective creative industry sector. I think there is something around, like you've mentioned, collective working amongst everyone who's working in this area across different sectors coming together, finding a way to formalize this informal um, uh, group of people working on this within and outside of organizations, and then also trying to figure out this. The other side of it is figuring out how to really affect systems change, working with these venues, these large organizations, these larger funders, councils and local government. So I think we're kind of at this moment, I feel personally, having worked in the sector for a long time now, I feel like we're kind of coming to this moment where we have to bring together these smaller coalitions of people working together in something a bit more of a larger movement that has a little bit more structure and coordination to it, but we're not losing our agility or responsiveness. Yeah, totally. But yeah, it's deeply frustrating. I'm sorry to hear that. And then, yeah.
Yeah, we could talk about this for literally hours. But we are out of time, unfortunately. Everyone needs to finish their lunch and I'm sure get back to many things. So we're going to close the session. Just to say again, if you're interested in reading the research paper, is on the Equal Media and Culture Centre's website. So please go there and read the full paper and get in touch with us. Our email address can be found on our website and also on that paper itself. So if you have any questions that you weren't able to get answered, or you wanted to get in touch about anything, please do reach out. And thank you so much, Halina, Veronique, and Sharon behind the scenes, and Amanda, who was captioning this event as well. It's really appreciated. And yeah, thank you so much for your time, everyone.